everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today is all about red. We are going to be looking at a 1% depth of shade of a number of different reds that are in my collection across a few brands. Definitely we'll be looking at Dharma acid dyes, Jacquard, and depending on the numbers, maybe a few others. Red is a tricky color because it needs to be really, really pigmented so that way it doesn't feel pink, but it also then needs to have some differences mixed in if you want something that is warmer toned, cooler toned, and things like that. And so I think that a lot of dye brands have more reds than almost any other color. And this isn't just looking at acid dye brands. Even the Wilton Colorite system that has only 8 colors of it, of those 8, 3 colors are dedicated to red and pink. And I actually also think in the Wilton icing color line, there are multiple colors that I would count as a red in there because you need so much more pigment to get that color mixed. So this is not a look at every single red in my collection, but we're gonna look at 10 different reds and see how they compare when we dye them a 1% depth of shade on mini skeins. And I may also throw in a crude swatch because honestly, we wanna see how the powders perform, right? When I went through my collection of dyes, it turns out that in just Dharma and Jacquard, I think there are 12 that I figured should be tested in this video. So I pre-soaked 2 more mini skeins and we're gonna go with 12 instead of 10. Now, I'll go through the color names a little bit later, but one thing that is fairly notable is that Jacquard's line has 40 colors, and 6 of these are colors that would work as a red. And with the Dharma colors, these are all cutouts of their paint swatches. The Fire Engine Red almost seems a little bit pinker than the other colors. The Poinsetta and Cayenne look a little bit more orange, but we'll see how these look on yarn. I just remember that these 6 colors, and I think those 6 colors, there's a lot of similarities between them with Crude Swatches. And as we go and measure out the dyes for each of these colors, I think I'm also going to do a crude swatch so that way we can see how these colors behave as the dye powder. And of these, I believe it's either the oxblood or the Chinese red. One of them won't be very visible until we add a lot more heat and acid. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves and started measuring out 0.2 grams of our 10 red acid dye colors. 0.2 grams is pretty small, and likely it is challenging to get this precisely with every color, but I really didn't want to make big stock solutions of 10 different reds because that would mean all my videos would be featuring red dye for a while. So we're gonna give this a try, and it might not be the most perfect 1% depth of shade, but I think it is a more workable solution, and depending on how all of this goes, then this might be something I can do for swatching again in the future. I also didn't want to dye 100 gram skeins because it would be easy to measure out 1 gram of dye because, well, then we'd also end up with 10 probably only slightly different reds that wouldn't be any remotely the same dye lot, and so I think that this made sense. Once I had the dye measured, I went a few at a time to then dissolve the powder in warm tap water, and I did label my containers so that way I could keep track of the different dyes that we are measuring out. I didn't worry about the total volume that I dissolved the dye into. In the end, every container will end up with a similar volume of water, and so I don't think that that total volume is a huge factor of consideration right now. Today we are going to be dyeing 20 gram mini skeins of Wool to Dye For's Crazy 8DK. This yarn is 100% superwash merino. And since we had just measured out 0.2 grams of each of the colors, these are 20 gram mini skeins. So we can get that 1% depth of shade, or the equivalent of 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. Oh man, our crude swatch yarn mop over here had 4 cups of water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, and it's 100 grams of knit pike stroll. And now I'm going to carefully set these guys aside so that way we can take a closer look here. Okay, on this side we have our 6 Dharma reds. On this side we have our 6 Jacquard. From Dharma we have Cherry Bomb, Fire Engine Red, Poinsetta, Cayenne, Chinese Red, and then Oxblood Red. And from Jacquard we have Fire Red, Crimson, Cherry Red, Russet, Scarlet, and Vermillion. And the Scarlet does not seem to dissolve very well. And I believe that my stock of the Fire Engine Red is also one that does not dissolve well. It was one I bought a few years ago that had like an asterisk of it that the dye lot was not perfect. Looking at this on the monitor, the colors look extremely similar. And so that's one reason why we are going to be looking at the 1% depths of shade. Now, yes, we can look at this and say, okay, some of these are a bit pinker, some of these are a bit more orange leaning, and some of them feel more pigmented. But hopefully, I don't know. I mean, I have a feeling that our 1% depths of shade of these colors are all going to look really similar as well. But hopefully the side-by-side comparisons can help you and maybe me decide which red to use. I would say of these, goodness, I think one of my favorites as like a red would be both Poinsetta from Dharma and Fire Red from Jacquard. I also really like oxblood, which is not one that I've used often, and same with Chinese Red. This one definitely got more and more intense as time went on. It sort of took a little bit of time to develop. But anyway, let's go ahead and prepare for our 1% depths of shade. As for this, I'm going to set it aside for now. We will finish heat setting it later. Our samples are not perfectly well mixed. The Fire Engine Red still has some of those clumps that can happen. The Chinese Red feels like it's not, it feels like it's more of a suspension. It almost feels a little chalky and powdery right now. Cherry Bomb also has a little bit of some stringiness to it, but right now it looks like it's way more pigmented than the Fire Engine Red. I believe that new stocks of Fire Engine Red don't have this same like gummy particulate issue. I remember in the past they did recommend that you filter that out. With our Jacquard colors, the Cherry Red does not feel nearly as pigmented. The Scarlet maybe is dissolving a little oddly. But yeah, those are some observations based on these colorways for now. Now I want to add water to each of these cups, stirring it up and eventually removing these wooden sticks until I get a fairly similar volume of water in each cup. I have a feeling the volume is going to be approximately 1 cup of water, but I'm not measuring exactly. I'm just trying to be consistent across each of our samples. The volume isn't perfectly even, but it is approximately, and that's what we're going for right now. Interestingly, you can definitely see a difference in how saturated some of these containers are, and so that depth of shade difference, how pigmented the colors feel, we might be able to make more comparisons between these different colors beyond just sort of that crude hue we looked at with the dry powder. But now we're going to start adding our 20-gram mini skeins into each. So this one is actually the oxblood red, and then this one over here I think is Vermillion, and I'm going to wipe up the little bit that was on the counter before adding the yarn in. We will stir things a bit better in a little bit, but the goal is to get the yarn in. Now, some of these that have particulates in them may end up seeing a little bit of like speckling to it. And that is what it is. It's a valid comparison between the colors. Okay, the water that the yarn was soaking in is a little bit cool because it had been soaking for a while and it's approaching winter and my house is cold. This is Jacquard Scarlet that I'm going into right now. But even though it is cold, the plan is to start at least with a cool vat approach to dyeing this yarn to let the colors absorb slowly. And then eventually we will transfer them to zip ties that are numbered so we can keep track. This is the Chinese Red, a very nice color. Now, one perk of doing a cold vat or cool vat approach is that we can look at multiple samples and I'm not setting up a new dye bath for each of these. So we'll let as much of the color as we can absorb to the yarn. Here is our cayenne. It is definitely more yellow toned, which makes sense if you think about the pepper. And so, I don't know, I like to do this cold process when I'm doing a lot of samples. When I'm pushing the yarn in with my fingers, I'm then wiping the finger off before touching any more yarn or dye. And this is our Russet Red, which, oh goodness, I'm expecting it to be a little bit less bright than some of the others, but of course we will see. This is our Poinsetta. Ooh, I think that's one of my favorite red colors. Here's Cherry Red, which I'm expecting to be less pigmented just because it did dissolve well and then is, you know, you could see the bottom. And so I'm expecting that to be interesting. I think it's not gonna be feeling very pink, but it's not gonna feel like a true red, especially compared to some of these others. But ooh, there's a reason why I come for Poinsetta over and over, I think. Okay, this is now Dharma's Fire Red that has those particulates. This is a primary. This is Crimson, a color I haven't used that much. You know, the Chinese Red and Oxblood are colors that I really haven't used. Opening the containers, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of dye in here, because I tend to lean for some of the same ones over and over. But I'm wondering now if the Fire Red really just is not as pigmented. This is Fire Engine Red. Sorry, no, this is Fire Red from Jacquard. This one is Fire Engine Red from Dharma. And yeah, I think my favorite primary red would be Jacquard's red there. And now that I'm looking at the two of these side by side, I can see why I like the Jacquard one better. It is more pigmented. It actually reminds me a bit of the Poinsetta. And then over here we have Cherry Bomb, which is another red that I use often, but does sometimes also have some particulates. Now, one thing I have not discussed thus far is reds bleeding when we wash them. And that is something that can very, very much happen, and I don't think we'll wash them individually, but we'll try to pay attention to it. But here we have our 12 reds. And as for acid, I'm gonna start with adding 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each of these containers, and then we'll come back and do a second one. Sometimes I might let things sit for a little bit so we can decide if we need to add more water or just to give the dyes time. But I think that it'll be, oh dear, it will be fine. And while we have some staining on these popsicle sticks, ultimately we don't have like too much color that has come off on them. Most of the color is definitely in our samples. I am going to carefully stir them just to distribute the acid a little bit into these containers. The Chinese Red is starting to develop, and that is really, really pretty. I don't think that the pictures and photographs are gonna do these colors justice. And for certain things, especially if you're trying to get a perfect red that you want for a various project, really it could be worth doing something like this yourself. One of my goals here was to see also if we could do this with measuring out such a small quantity of dye. And I think it overall worked pretty well. I have a feeling that what we're seeing here does seem to echo a little bit what we saw with our crude swatches. We just have a little bit more information about the pigmentation. The thing about when you're comparing a depth of shade to other colors is that it is a comparison of how much pigment is probably there. And so in this case, we can say, okay, we've got this one is a lot darker color than that one. There's probably more pigment. If I want to have a shade that feels more similar between the two, then I would need to use more of this one or less of that one. And so that's the kind of comparison you can get when you're using the same depth of shade across different colors. However, if we were doing different yarn bases for all of these, that comparison would start to get a lot harder. But now I'm gonna set these aside for a couple of days until the color has absorbed. Since it is cold outside and cooler inside, this may take a little bit longer than it would in the summer, but if we need to, we can certainly steam set the colors in these containers later on. So we'll see how things go. in a couple days when we check back in. Oh, and some of the lids I'm using do have numbers on them, but the numbers for our samples are on the sides of the containers. So don't feel confused if I'm seeing a number 15 somewhere. I told you we'd come back to our swatch skein. The first thing I want to do, because we're not going to be able to keep all of these from spreading, is to encourage some spreading by adding some water on top. Because some of these colors maybe would have started to strike without a lot of heat. Certainly we saw some of them that just sort of really wanted to expand and spread. Now, I don't know how balanced our finished yarn is going to end up feeling. It's possible it's not going to feel very balanced at all, and we may end up wanting to over dye it later, or re-dye it to help make things feel better. But that's something that sometimes it's hard to know on a swatch until the end, because it's hard to know how many strands have, like, you know, is that all one strand that's going to have like a really big section of white without a little more intense color. That we'll know later on. But for now, we're going to heat set this, and then actually I changed my mind. I'm going to turn on the heat, yes, but we're going to get some more dye. I have an old stock solution of cherry bomb here, and I started adding it in some places and moving it through like we're having some other little swatches here to try to make the overall colorway feel a little more balanced. And this color will probably spread out a bit. It will strike a bit where we've put it, but, and there are going to be, you know, there's a number of different reds that we have going on, but hopefully this will make our finished yarn feel a little bit more balanced. Plus, we're using up a stock solution that we have. And I'm going to go rinse this out. I'm so excited that I realized that I'm like, oh wait, I have some reds. I have some reds we can use that'll hopefully make things feel more cohesive. I'm very excited. Now, things are not that warm yet, and so I'm going to continue to sort of move it around. We have added color mostly to one side, less to the other. And, you know, we might still decide that we want to over dye this at some point, but certainly we have a little bit more coverage, and so we'll see what we think. I'm going to add a bit more acid. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat this for 30 minutes. It's been 30 minutes. We are very steamy. And I added about 10 minutes ago, I added some more acid because there's still some color in there, and I think that that helped. I'm going to turn off the heat, let this cool off completely so we can wash it. Let's quickly wash this leave no dye behind yarn. I think overall this skein has, I just added some clear dish soap. I think that this skein has less dye on it than proportionally each of our minis. And so I am really hoping that we don't, oh no. I was like, we got some bleeding. I'm not worried yet because it's the first rinse, but this could be a sign of what we may see later. Now, there's a couple of colors that did not dissolve completely, and so that is color we have to rinse out. So I'm not going to be afraid of the bleeding yet. But let's see where we are, because if this is feeling the same amount of pink or lighter, then I think we're in good shape. All right, we are in good shape. This is significantly lighter than what we had from that very first rinse. So what I'm going to do is put a tiny bit of dish soap in here, fill this up with water, and I'm going to let this go ahead and soak for a little bit. Really submerge and soak, so that way if there's anything kind of hanging out, it has a chance to dissolve. All right, it's been a few minutes, and we are seeing more pink here. We did add soap again, which can cause some things to dislodge, question mark. And so as we fill this up, this does not mean that every single set of 1% miniskeins will bleed. Some of them might. But even if I were to wash each of them individually, that wouldn't necessarily give us the best indication if the yarn is going to bleed, because a 20-gram mini skein alone in this volume of water, whatever comes off will look fairly pastel. And so that's one thing where, like, when you're dyeing minis, sometimes it's not a good indication on how, like, a large quantity might behave. But see, this is so much better already. That is great. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse this a couple more times. We're seeing almost nothing coming out now, thank goodness. And when I'm done rinsing it, I'm going to put it through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and you'll next see me when it's time to check back in with our mini skeins. But before we go and look to see which colors absorbed to our yarn with our Cool Vat approach, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Jessica Parco, Tamara Svanes, Don Jans, Karen Siegel, and the rest of the fiber patrons whose names you see on the screen right now. Patreon is a really great way that you can help support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and get some fun perks at the same time. You can find more details at the ChemKnits Patreon. There'll be a link down in the video description. And so to all of my patrons, thank you so much for all of your support. It's been a couple of days, but I'm now ready to look at the yarn. Most of the dye had absorbed within 24 hours, even with my house a little bit cold. But, you know, timing-wise, it's Monday morning now. So I'm gonna remove all of the lids and we can start taking a closer look. Now, I will mention that I'm glad that I store these containers inside a 5-gallon bucket because there was some leaking I observed when I removed them. So I am gonna make sure I wash that bucket really well because I use that to dye stuff. I'm not gonna go through and give my opinions of all of these colors right now. I will say there is a lot more variation than I had originally expected, and I'm very happy with that. Now I am going to start removing the yarn from the containers, squeezing out a lot of the liquid, and then adding on a numbered zip tie. So that way I will be able to keep track of which mini skein came from which dye. I'm not going to be very concerned if I see chunks in some of the containers, especially some of them that had chunks before, or if we see a little bit of pink left behind. But if we see a lot of dye, then we'll sort of hold that skein for a little bit later. Okay, so notably, the Dharma Fire Engine Red still has some particles in there, and we're still seeing color in the water. The other one where we also see a lot of color is Jacquard's Scarlet. And actually these two reds, I know I said I would compare later, do feel slightly similar. And I've also been feeling this whole time that Poinsetta is going to be a favorite, and there's almost no color left in there. As for the rest, there's a little bit of particle here in the Chinese red, but otherwise things seem to have dissolved and struck to the yarn reasonably well. Now, the amount of color left in these cups is not 100% indicative of which colors would be the biggest bleeders. The water, when we start washing, will likely be pink at first because there's some liquid that might need to be rinsed out, but who knows, it might set more. But so some of the where we're seeing the more color in here could be indicative of colors that require more heat in order to bind to the yarn, because don't forget, we have not heat set any of this yet. I have finally ordered a new Fire Engine Red from Dharma, and unfortunately it's not going to be here in time for me to test for the purposes of this video, but leave a comment below if you would like me to see my older Fire Engine Red batch versus the new one in a comparison. But either way, this is actually a lighter red compared to a lot of the others. So yeah, I'm curious to see like a non-clumpy version, hopefully, of this dye. Now I am actually going to put on all of the numbered zip ties. I ended up not doing that yet. And we're going to steam set everything all together, because if we have transfer between any of these, it's going to be fairly minimal. They're all in the same type of family, even if some are a little more pink and some are a little more orange. And now I'm going to bring the yarn over to a steamer basket that just has plain water in the bottom. And again, these skeins are all going to be touching each other. Hopefully it won't be too crowded. I feel like this is the most zip ties I've ever had. And I hope you're proud of me for having all of the minis labeled so we'll know who is who in the end. Because, I mean, that's the important part of this video. But anyway, I am going to steam set this for 30 minutes. And I'm going to start the timer once the steamer basket looks to be nice and steamy, so it becomes harder to see through. And it already seems to be boiling, so that's gonna happen very, very shortly. It has been 30 minutes, and so now we can turn off the heat to let things start to cool. Now, I do want to check, because sometimes as things are setting, some color can drip down below. All right, and good news, the water that is beneath all of our steamed yarn is looking really clear. Now, I think we can also do a little touch test. I'm not seeing anything. Nope, I did see one little glob of dye transfer onto my glove. That could have been from one of the ones that was a little globbier. All right, what we're gonna do is I am going to let things sit here. Still on the pot, it'll get a little bit more heat and cool down slowly. But once things are cool, then we will go and wash it. I'm gonna leave the yarn here on the pot with a little more heat for just a tiny bit, but then I will remove the skeins and set them aside so they can cool completely to room temperature, so then we can wash our yarn. Let's wash all of these minis. I feel like this is the most zip ties I will ever have washing at the same time. Let me see if I can get this a bit organized. The nice thing about zip ties is that if you keep a good handle on them during the washing stage, then that can help you prevent like introducing tangles into the system. All right, I'm seeing a hint of some color in there. We'll see if we get more once we start adding some soap. I'm expecting a little bit of bleeding because we had some like particles left in some of the dye baths, and so if that didn't, with the addition of heat, set, then we may see that introduced in here. And you can see on some of the zip ties evidence of some transfer from some of the reds. Not all of the dyes have struck to the yarn really, really quickly and enough to not need heat. But as I said before, I'm not washing them individually, so not all of them are likely causing that little bit of bleeding. It's probably just a handful of these minis. But if I were to wash them individually, then it might be really, really hard to see that in the volume of water that we're using. And I'm thankful that that is pretty light overall. I'm gonna fill this basin up with water. Okay, we overflowed a little bit. This is so many zip ties. I probably should have put a zip tie to like bind the zip tie bundle together. Oh no, see, and we dropped one. That's why the zip ties are good. Otherwise it would have been really hard to keep like all the minis and all the colors separate. All right, I'm still seeing not very much bleeding given how red all this yarn is. We have 200 grams of yarn here and there's barely any color. I'm gonna wash it a few more times off camera, and then I'm gonna put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry so we can look at the finished yarn. But this level of color in there, I'm not super concerned about. However, that doesn't mean that these colors wouldn't bleed if you knit them with white yarn and then went to block it. And so the thing I recommend you do if you have a red yarn or a saturated color and you want to mix it with white and it's something you intend to wash, I recommend that you knit a swatch and wash that swatch as you plan to wash it and see if the colors bleed into the neighboring skeins. Because a little bleeding in the water doesn't mean that that color would soak up in an imperceptible way on other in other sections. That's not a lot of color. The concern would be if this red were to bleed a little bit and then transfer onto the skeins, onto the stitches right next to it versus just go into the water. So a swatch is a great way to test. But anyway, let's look at the finished yarn. Let's start out by looking at our swatched yarn. It is so fun to see how the different colors spread out over the yarn. And actually, there is another way that we could have swatched all these colors on mini skeins. We could have swatched them on the mini skeins, poured water on to see which ones spread out a ton and which ones don't. Because some colors would strike faster than others. And so the fact that we ended up with something that is so tonal is cool. And we've definitely got pinker, there's more yellow in sections. There's a lot of different color in here, but we got really lovely coverage. And I love how this yarn turned out. I'm also really glad to have the crude swatches of the 12 colors we looked at today. This is something that I will refer to a lot, especially if I'm going to be dealing with some kind of speckles. Because while it doesn't tell me how the colors may spread out and which would or wouldn't, it does compare the different hues of them together. And so then I know, okay, if I want to use two of these together or maybe not, it's just a point of reference that I can use. But now let's go look at our 1% depths of shade. I laid out the 12 skeins where we have number 1 over on the far left and number 12 over on the far right. And looking at this on the monitor, I don't think this is the best way to compare them. In person, I look at this and I see all these different colors and I'm like, ooh, ooh, ah. I feel like I was able to get a decent picture on my phone. Let me try changing the white balance more. Maybe this is a little bit closer to what I see. This is the white balance I used on my phone. And I'm gonna go ahead and label that phone picture, and I think it'll come up maybe at an angle, but I'm gonna write all the color names on that and share that with you here. There are a couple of things that stand out to me that I want to draw attention to before I rearrange how the yarn is set up. My batch of Dharma's Fire Engine Red, which had all those splotches in it, does have the most, I think, splotch variation on it compared to all of the other colors. And the Fire Engine Red, which is the primary red, is less saturated than Cherry Bomb and Poinsetta. Of the Dharma colors, the Poinsetta feels the most true red to me compared to the other colors. Cayenne is definitely more orange. Chinese Red and Oxblood are both a little bit more muted overall. The Fire Engine Red, it's potentially my batch. I will do a video comparison at some point when I have my new batch in to see if that feels brighter. And I would say Cherry Bomb feels like a hair more burgundy, a hair less bright. If I bring over Jacquard's Fire Red, which is a true primary red, it is one of the best. It matches Poinsetta the most to me. Any small notes about Jacquard 6 reds? Scarlet feels more orange than the Fire Red. The Vermillion and Crimson are a little bit similar. The Vermillion is a little bit more purple. The Russet Red feels like it fits its name, and Cherry is much more pink than I was expecting. I wonder what this one would be like if you turned up the volume a lot. The swatches are lollipopped slightly oddly here, but that is so I can still keep these zip ties on and a little bit out of the way. But I do think I'm going to smush things together a little bit more. I feel like I see way more variation and nuance here in the dry swatches where we had a 1% depth of shade than I did looking at either the labels on the jars or at our crude swatches. A lot of the colors felt a lot more similar when you're looking at that concentrated dye powder. But where you get more nuance in with these different colors is when you use them as they were intended. And the way that these were intended and the colors were developed for particular depths of shade on yarn. And if you go and look at the websites of different dye companies, Dharma and Jacquard both recommend a depth of shade for different colors. And I didn't go look specifically for these 12, but it's possible that some of them they may recommend using a little more, some a little bit less to get that intended shade. Now, obviously you can use a lot less, you can use a lot more, that's all up to you. But we have variety in here between colors that I feel sort of scream more red versus being a light red bordering on pink. You can look at this and say, okay, these colors are more saturated, these ones are a little bit less. So if I want a brighter red with one of these three colors, I'm going to need to use more of it. And if I want a soft red, I'm going to need to use less of some of those other colors. I said this, I think I said this earlier in the video, but there's a reason why there are so many different reds available. Not just because it comes in handy for color mixing to maybe start with a red that is way more saturated and one that is less, but There are different applications and different types of reds, and because it's a pigment that is overall, you have so much pigment so it doesn't feel pink, getting those shifts are harder to mix, and so there's a demand to have them available already. But now I'm gonna have some fun, and I am going to mix things up and turn this set of 12 into 2 different sets of 6 that I think would be fun mini skein sets to keep together. And I am going to be mostly keeping the digital swatches, but if you're doing this for yourself, it would be worthwhile to take a snip of the yarn, put it around a color card so that way you can have it as a reference to go back and see, okay, at a 1% depth of shade, that's what this color looks like. And you can do that for different recipes you make as a way to have a physical color reference. But it is worth keeping in mind that sometimes a different batch of the same dye color might be slightly different, and the way that dyes look on one yarn base may be slightly different on a different yarn base if one is a little bit more yellow or things like that. But as a handy starting off point, I think that having swatches, proper swatches more like this, are really, really handy. What do you think of these 2 sets and the way I set it out? Things could obviously be used in a slightly different order, but man, it's hard because things look so cool in person, and when I'm looking at the little LCD screen, I'm not sure if that's coming through on camera. Here we have 6, 8, 7, 5, 4, 1, and here we have 9, 2, 3, 1, 10, 12. And yeah, some of those I'm like, oh, okay, I know which one this is, but I'm gonna let you look at the references on the side to determine which color is which here. But anyway, I'm gonna go twist up all these minis now, which means we're gonna have to say goodbye. We're saying goodbye to our labels. Well, here are our mini sets, and it's funny how twisted, kind of bundled together in relative fades that the colors do feel a lot more similar to one another than it did when we had them in the lollipops. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please make sure you are subscribed, turn on notifications, give the video a thumbs up, you know the deal. And are there other colors you would like me to do something like this for? I still plan to do crude swatches of all of my reds someday, and that would be pulling in the reds that I have from Greener Shades, Paradise Fibers. I don't have all of the Pro Chem reds, but I have a couple that we could use to look at all the ones that I have in my collection. And there are other colors I still want to look at, like greens. Greens are actually pretty high on my list, and my oranges too, I think. If you love the ChemKnits content, please go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. It's a great way to help support the content here. You can learn more at patreon.com/ChemKnits, or you can find the link down in the video description. Thank you so much for watching.